Now, you perhaps have seen these before, the climate stripes. Now, up until about, I don't know, let's say there, 2005, I sort of thought, when it all goes pear-shaped, I shall be dead. Do you know the wonderful passage in Isaiah 39, it's also repeated in Kings, where King Hezekiah asks Isaiah's just been telling him all the disastrous things that are going to be happening. And Hezekiah says, so when's this going to happen? In the lifetime of my sons or in my lifetime? And Isaiah says, in the lifetime of your sons. And Hezekiah says, oh, good. No. That red is getting stronger and stronger. My colleague has come up with these photographs, which are quite dramatic, but I think a little bit misleading in terms of the timescale. Here's Buckingham Palace at 1.5 degrees Celsius global warming, which, by the way, we're going to overshoot. I can't see how we can possibly avoid that. But that's multi-century rise, because the sea level will rising quite slowly. And then if we get to 3, we will certainly need the Royal Navy to transport the royal family about. But long before we get that, there are all sorts of other climate impacts that will cause much faster problems. One of the most important one is food supply, because agriculture is struggling all around the world. We know it from Britain, but especially in some of the more developing countries. And that will mean that people will start to move. And we could end up not just with a few boat people trying to cross the channel, but with massive movements of people, and with that will come massive social dislocation. Well, maybe for that reason, maybe for others, the General Synod back in 2020 got hijacked. They had a motion before them that the Church of England would attain net zero carbon by 2045, 5 years earlier than the government target, but a widespread view was that 2045 was a sensible date to go for. And then a cunning group of people put in an amendment that instead of 2045, it should be 2030. And they got it passed by a whisker. And then General Synod didn't have the courage to vote it down. And so we now have the General Synod commitment to net zero by 2030. We're not going to make it, but of all the different organisations that I have engagement with, the Church of England is more determined on net zero than any other that I know of. I'm proud of that, but of course it comes at a cost and a difficulty. The most obvious ones, as it were, being how do we keep our churches warm? I'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. We have an action plan which was approved by our Diocesan Synod, and one of the things that for me is really important, I didn't write the draft, is we understand this as mission. So, although the headline is net zero carbon, the motivation behind it is this is going to be part of the key way in which the Church of England will survive, or otherwise, into the next generation. Some people talk a little bit about how, young people are really fired up by this. I've been a university chaplain for 20 years. I don't think they're fired up. They're just scared. Going back to that. Somebody who's 20 now, by the time they're 70, what sort of colour are they going to have on that graph? So, eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow you die. So there's a lot of fatalism around, but they're also, I think, searching for hope and some sort of leverage. I'm going off piste on my talk altogether, so never mind about it. come back somehow. And what I think we need to do, this has come out of a coffee break that I've just had. Anyway, the person responsible will feel guilty. What I think we need to do is to say what our Christian faith is about is the moment on the cross when the great chaos of the world starts to be reversed. Paul in Romans 8, the whole creation is waiting for us to be liberated, as it were, by the work of God. So we are part of the work of God about liberating the rest of creation. Well, now, let's get back a bit more on track. So, it is about building, so it's not just about building, by the way. Here's a little diagram that the National Church has come up with, and then this is a really useful tool that they have come up with as well, called the Practical Path to Net Zero for Churches. They've done other practical paths for schools and offices and various other things. And it's divided up into, sections. So where do we start? Where do we go next? Where do we finish off? That sort of thing. And it's a little kind of checklist just for you won't be able to read this, it's too far away. For you to, as it were, to think through, well, what might we be able to do? Here's a slightly larger script of it, just selecting one or two of the things. Where do we start? Well, the first starting point is your gutters. This is not about, we must put PV on every church roof. Follow the example of King's Chapel. King's Chapel is wonderful, but actually we don't particularly advise churches to go for PV on roofs unless there are particular circumstances. It's about maintaining the fabric first of all. And then you can do things, if you are using electricity to some extent, go to 100% renewable tariff. It's a bit more expensive, but not a lot. And then, whereas other things, you can do something small, like turning your heaters off, if you've got radiators, 15 minutes before the end of the service, rather than at the end of the service or afterwards. Does the PCC need to meet in the church? Now, here's another little story. When I was actually a parish priest, I had a wonderful, large, ginormous rectory. It had 7 bedrooms. We didn't keep the house very warm. And I would say to the PCC, do you want to meet in the rectory? Oh, no, let's try and find somewhere else. So, so there may be somewhere else, somebody else's front room, that might be nice and warm. And then it says down here, for most low-usage Sunday churches, once they've taken steps like these, their remaining non-renewable energy might be very small. So our target, and this will be a great relief, I think, to many of you who come from village churches, our target is the top 20% of churches and their emissions. That's not to say that we don't interested in the emissions of the other ones, but that's where the real changes need to take place. Now, here are a few others. Check your energy bills. I mean, have you made sure that you're not paying the climate change levy? I'm not sure how you do it, but there are instructions how you do that. If you've got dual rate meter, is the timing right? When you're actually using it, etc. And check your meter readings and then experiment. One of the most important ways in which we can improve efficiency is to try and make sure that the heating comes on when you really want it and off when you really need it off. And that can be quite tricky depending on your arrangement. Right. Furthermore, if you're a fairly small church, or at least meet just once on a Sunday or less, try and heat the people and not the building. Some people complain about this and say, if you get it right, it works very well. I can tell you that because when I was a parish priest, we went for under-pew heaters and it was amazing. Everybody loved it. It was at the start of the decade of evangelism. Do you remember that? And I said to my PCC, the most important thing we need to do for our decade of evangelism is to keep people warm. And we put the under-pew heating in, and it worked. So, and then get somebody who sort of reads the meter and chivvies you and say, oh, vicar, or oh, churchwarden, have you realised that we spent more, we heated the church unnecessarily? And one of the ways in which you can measure that is the energy footprint tool. This is an annual exercise in which the Church of England tries to discover how much energy, gas, oil, electricity, whatever, is being used in our churches and church halls. And in fact, not just that, but all sorts of other buildings as well, though it has a different name for them. Now, that helps the Church of England nationally, helps us in the diocese, and it helps you, because you can monitor how your electricity or whatever is doing. Is it going up, down, or whatever? I can say, with great pride, that the National Church has set a target for dioceses that we get 90% participation in the energy footprint tool. When it first was set, I thought, we were getting about 20% participation. Thank you to you, Churchwardens, because this year our diocese is one of the few who have achieved 90% return rate. 90%.
That was the weekly emails.
As well done for the lady.
Sasha, indeed, that's the lady there. Sasha sort of busted her guts for that. And she was so disappointed. We were 89.5 or something away. And then she just managed to get one last thing and got it over the line for 90. But Sasha is not only persistent, which is obviously really important, though annoying, she's also helpful. So if you're having difficulties, she will try and help you through that. This is how you do it, etc., etc. And if you persuade her that you're completely IT illiterate or whatever, she may even do more than that for you. Now, the result of that is that 53% of the churches in our diocese are using fossil fuels. So that's just a bit over half. But the other thing is, about 50% of these are using systems that are over 20 years old. That's both an opportunity and really scary. One of the things that we're really keen on doing is to say to parishes, think about how you're going to cope when your heating collapses. Because if you're not doing anything, it will, at some point. So think ahead. And you've got several things to think about. Do you have some backup ideas as to what you'll do when it collapses? What sort of options do you have? And then start thinking about your long-term heating. So that, let's say you've got oil boilers, and they're already quite old, and you think to yourself, what do we do? Well, one of the things is you start thinking, well, how might we be able to replace those oil boilers, let's say in 5 years' time? Let's start planning for that now, fundraising, getting a kitty together for it, etc., as well as designing it, so that if year 3 they go, you've got some chance of actually being able to do some emergency work and actually managing to achieve your heating plan. So for your long-term heating plan, do talk to Sasha. I mean, it says the DAC here, but she's our heating sort of guru person. And if you're a high-emitting church, one of the top 20%, then we will particularly try and steer you in the route of an audit. We've been able to negotiate a fairly cheap audit rate with a company called Inspired Efficiency, which are the most recommended company in the C of E for doing this sort of work. Fortunately, one of their staff members lives in Cambridge and is able to go out and do these things. When you've done the audit, you get back a whole lot of recommendations, a whole lot of tables about how much carbon you'll be saving and how much it would cost, etc., etc. And that really helps steer, well, how might we go forward? There are various stuff on the internet, particularly for the National Church of England. You might I wouldn't say straight away, but at some point, obtain some professional advice, actually throwing some money at them to do that, and all along keep in track with us in the DAC, so that, if one or two parishes come to us quite late in the process and have already made up their minds, really, and we say, well, actually, we're not sure that that really is sensible for you. Please think again. But if people have already thought, they find it very difficult to think again. So come and engage early on to explore. Now, the solutions are difficult. What I mean by that is, when Sasha and I attended a conference a year and a half ago, the National Church put on, it seemed as if solutions were very easy. If you were a fairly low-use church, you did heat the people. If you were a really high-use church, you did an air source heat pump. And this is the sort of diagram that sort of organises that. But in practice, life is more complicated. And there are all sorts of challenges about what to do. But one of the things that has come up that is really, I think, quite exciting is, yes, an air source heat pump, but not into heating water, but into heating the air, which then can be blown onto, so it's sort of halfway between heat the people and radiator system. It may or may not be right for your church. And here just one or two little illustrations. Some people say, we can't have infrared heaters because they look horrible, and the DAC would never approve them. We approve a lot. One or two times we say, let's have it somewhere just slightly different place on the wall or whatever. One or two times we say, that's not really the kit that you want. Let's try and change it and find something a little bit more elegant. But there are various ways in which that can be done. Don't ever think that the DAC is going to automatically reduce flats. And then this is localised heating. There's the organist, I suppose. Well, I'm not sure, actually. Having a leg warmer. Perhaps that's meant to be an under-pew heating. And then there are various cushions. What we haven't illustrated here is something that I think is really a real possible winner. 2 years ago now, I bought my wife a heated gilet. I don't know whether you've come across these. So they're sort of slightly felty things, so they're quite warm in themselves. And then you have one of these sort of rechargeable battery things, and then they have electric heating panels, and she's really warm and toasty. If you've got a small congregation, it may be a whole lot easier to really heat the people. They're not necessarily. If you're sort of thinking about them, one of them, and you think, well, it's quite expensive for a jacket. You can probably get one for about £200. They're cheaper ones as well, but the good ones are probably about that price. But when you think about the cost of installing some other type of heating system, if you've got a regular congregation of 10 people, you'd be probably a whole lot better off doing that. And you might even be able to persuade them to buy their own so they can wear them at home as well.
What I did earlier.
Yeah. Anyway, these are some air heat pumps, and you can see that they can be quite, not discreet, they're fairly obvious, but they fit in as well. And of course, they're only going to be there for, 20 years until the technology changes. Lighting. Actually, there's quite a lot of energy goes into lighting churches. The Church of England has got sort of guidance on it. And one of the things is, how much light do you really need? I like to talk about the Givons effect. It has other names which I can never hold on to, something to my age, I think. But Givons is a nice word to hold on to. It's exciting. Anyway, he was a 19th century economist. And what he pointed out was that even in the 19th century, if you provided some sort of improved efficiency, instead of them using less energy, they use the same amount of energy and were warmer. And the same thing applies, as it were, to lighting. Oh, well, we've got LED lighting. Let's improve the lighting there. Or, I'm going to upset some people here, I've got an EV car, so I can have what now is called an SUV, 5 times bigger than I really need, look as if I'm a farmer, but I actually live in West Kensington. You know, and so watch that, and particularly on the light. So there's a guidance as to how much lighting you really need in a church. There we are. Now, another thing is, there are quite a lot of case studies and webinars that the National Church of England has, and we'd encourage you to go and have a look at them. Now, there's also the problem of climate resilience, or adaptation. The Climate Change Committee, the statutory committee for Britain, has been saying to several governments, look, you're just ignoring the problem. You know, back to the climate strikes. Whatever Britain does over our carbon emissions, the climate's going to change. We need to be ready for that. So are we ready for droughts and floodings and wind damage and wildfires and that sort of stuff? One of the really nice things about the PV on King's Chapel was I thought, I'll see if I can catch them out. Have they thought of adaptation? Have they planned the downpipes from the roof to cope with the added rainfall that we're expecting? Well, I was dealing with Kings, and they had. But that is something that you and your architects, as it were, need to be thinking about. Are we able to cope with that? And that is also something that we might think about in terms of mission. Many churches are quite interested in warm hubs, which is very important when, you know, fuel poverty and things like that for people to come along. You might remember in some of the flooding instances, Tewkesbury or whatever, the churches, also were often built on slightly higher land. Medievals knew what they were doing. And they then came to sort of the food dispenser and various other sort of resource areas. So thinking about how might we as a church be some sort of a hub in some sort of disaster planning, and use that as a way of engaging with the rest of a village if that's the sort of parish you have. Now, biodiversity, I'm really a biologist, I don't really know anything much about electricity. And I got into all of this as a teenager because already back in the 1960s, it was obvious that things were going down the pan, really, biologically. Here's the Living Planet Index. It's on a log scale, so it doesn't look nearly as bad as it really is. You're actually looking from 1970, where they had a sort of arbitrary figure of 1, as it were, and we're now down to about 27%. Massive drop. And that's rapid. So 4 points on scale down in the past 2 years. This is the latest data, although it only actually goes up to 2020. And global biodiversity crisis, this is about what's called intactness of nature. The black bits are the most intact, basically because there's nothing there to sort of untact, you know, a little bit looking at the tundra. Britain here, though, is the sort of completely disincacted, whatever one might like to say it is. We are in a mess. And my old county of Essex is a nice illustration of this. I don't know how well you're able to sort of see this, but this is a map of Essex. You might just about be able to make it out. The green numbers are just the Ordnance Survey grid numbers. The blue numbers are the species of plants that were detected in the period 2000 to 2020. Well, actually, just short of that, because I think it was 2019. And then the red numbers are all of those plants that had been detected in that square before, but which couldn't be found in that 20-year period. And you'll see that it varies quite a lot, but about 10% of those species could not be found again after 2000. So this is, as it were, a bit like hair loss. You know, you lose a bit, okay, you can sort of cope. But eventually, it gets to the point when you think, well, perhaps I'll just go for a close shave. We don't want to do that with our nature. So churchyards, it's one of the things I've been particularly interested in, are important. Here, this is a Norfolk survey, and they calculated that roughly half of these 6 species of plants are found in churchyards by comparison to the wider countryside. They ought to be really common plants around the whole thing, but they're not. Then that churchyards have become, as it were, their reserve. In Cambridgeshire, we are not so well off for these things anyway. And of course, some of you may be from Norfolk as well, in which case, that will more apply to you. And then all sorts of other things you have. The fungi, some very special fungi that are found in grassland, and especially in churchyard grassland. This is Essex data. Mosses, exciting things here. There's these 2 ones here under Cambridge mosses are found in Grantchester churchyard. Lichens, an amazing quantity, about I think the number there, it's a bit confusing actually, but I think it means that when they surveyed 160 churches, most of them had over 100 species of lichens on the headstones, on the walls, that sort of thing. Then trees. Now in Cambridgeshire we don't have so many ancient trees, but in Essex we did. Norfolk, no doubt, we do as well. Swifts. I was wandering around my village, I live in Iceland, 2 summers ago, and we met a man just sort of standing, looking up into the sky. So my wife and I said to him, "Oh, hello, what are you doing?" And he said, "I'm looking at the swifts." And we then had a quick conversation to realise that summer, these were one of the few moments when we had seen swifts. Although when we first moved to Iceland 20 years ago, the sky would be full of screaming swifts all summer. When I first moved to Rivenhall in Essex 40 years ago, we used to have flocks and flocks of lapwing. But by the time I'd left 20 years later, they'd all gone. Then bats. Oh! Oh!
I would just like to say churches are doing a very good job of looking after them. Yeah.
They are.
But one of the reasons why they're in churches is that where they would normally be elsewhere in the landscape, they can't be because they've lost ancient trees, they've lost sort of open barns, they've either been demolished or they've been turned into people's homes and things like that. So we end up looking after them. By the way, there are better ways of looking after bats than there used to be in the past. Come and talk to us if you've got real bat problems. Now, we've got Cambridgeshire Wildlife Trust. We're working closely with them. And we are also working with the Norfolk Wildlife Trust. And there's a wonderful national group working on it as well. Now, trees, in addition to the wildlife side of it, there's also the health and safety side of it. And so we do need to work through the faculty system if you're wanting to do it on trees. And then lastly, I better be very quick with this. Eco-church framework, we do encourage parishes to get into the framework over eco-church. And there are lots of different topics you can work on with them. And we're hoping that people will move through from registering to bronze to silver to gold. It covers the sort of theology and mission as well as buildings and wildlife and lots of other things as well. And when you get back, amongst other things, do see if you can get your church engaged on the eco-church journey. And then, in connection with that, we run a quarterly Zoom session. That I'm going to stop at that point and hand over to the Archie.